All right, so today we're really going to try to crack the code on Uber Eats earnings.
Yeah, we're going deep on this one.
Not just the usual stuff everyone talks about. We want to look at how to actually maximize those payouts.
Love it.
And I think what makes this deep dive so interesting is that Uber Eats, it works a bit differently than some of its competitors,
Yeah,
right?
great.
So we're going to really look at how their payment structure, how things like time and mileage factor in, how that lets us use some really interesting strategies.
Yeah, and I think what's so intriguing about this particular deep dive is that, the payment structure of Uber Eats lends itself well to some unique optimization strategies. It's different from a lot of the other apps out there in that it does pay per mile. It has a wider range of orders that you can possibly choose from.
So it seems like we're saying that with Uber Eats, it's not just about clocking in and out. It's almost like you're treating each delivery like its own little
Yeah,
mini business opportunity,
exactly.
right?
And, the source that we're looking at today actually calls this out as the hourly rate myth.
Interesting.
A lot of drivers, they get caught up in thinking about, okay, I want to make this much per hour, but Uber Eats pays to delivery.
Right.
And I think that's really key because it kind of shifts your focus away from just being on the clock and more about squeezing the most value out of each trip that you take.
So that makes sense. But I mean, I'm guessing the source isn't saying to completely ignore your hourly earnings, right?
Not at all. And they actually mentioned that most Uber Eats drivers, they make somewhere between $12 and $17 an hour on average,
Okay, that's good to know.
which gives you good
Right.
benchmark. But I think the thing that they emphasize is that figure, that's just an average.
Yeah.
With the right approach,
Right.
you can absolutely surpass that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what this is about. How do you do that?
Okay, so now we're talking. So what are some of the things that this source, what do they actually recommend for making that happen?
So they start off with a pretty fundamental concept.
Mm-hmm.
They say sometimes you got to hustle. I mean,
Yeah.
it's math at the end of the day.
Mhm.
Even if you add a little bit of extra time to your week, that can add up over the course of a year.
Right. I think that's something that we can all understand at a very basic level.
Right, right.
But I think what's interesting about Uber Eats specifically is they have that whole surge pricing thing.
Right.
Like, as a customer, I know I've been in that situation where it's like dinner time on a rainy Tuesday and suddenly, bam, surge pricing.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, I guess I'm paying extra, but I also know that some driver out there is getting a nice little bonus.
Exactly. And you've seen it firsthand. You understand how those dynamics play out. The article really digs into that a little bit more, highlighting those peak times.
Right.
Obviously, lunch and dinner rush, those are going to be big ones.
Sure.
But specifically calling out how Uber Eats surge pricing model can lead to some pretty serious earnings boost. Sometimes almost double
Almost double.
the usual rate.
Wow. Okay, so, I mean, that's pretty significant.
Yeah.
So if a driver is strategic about when they work,
Right.
those peak times could be, really lucrative.
Exactly. And this is all magnified, too, by the sheer size and scale of Uber Eats.
Oh, interesting.
They work with over 500,000 restaurants
Wow.
in the United States alone. So you've got this huge pool of potential orders, especially during those really high demand periods.
That's a lot of takeout. Okay, so we've got putting in the hours, especially during those peak times. What other strategies does this source recommend for really maximizing earnings?
So this is where I think things get really interesting.
Okay.
They introduce a tactic that they call multi-apping, which is essentially juggling orders from Uber Eats and other delivery platforms at the same time.
Hold on. Are we talking about becoming like a delivery app acrobat here?
Yeah, kind of.
How do you even manage multiple orders like that at the same time? That sounds pretty intense.
It definitely is a more advanced tactic,
Mm-hmm.
but I think, at its core, it's about maximizing your efficiency,
Okay.
minimizing that downtime between orders.
So I'm with you. So like while you're waiting for that Uber Eats pickup, maybe you could snag a quick DoorDash delivery down the street.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's the thing. You're essentially like getting paid while you wait.
Okay.
And this can make a huge difference, I think, in your overall earnings, especially if you're currently only using one app.
It's like a cheat code for the gig economy.
Yeah.
All right. Now, speaking of things that can really boost your earnings, the source mentions that tips are a huge deal for Uber Eats drivers.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe even more so than with some of those other platforms.
It's huge. Yeah, and they actually go beyond just saying that they're important. They actually offer some, I think, pretty insightful tips on how to actually encourage more generous tips from customers.
Now, that's something that, I'm always curious about
Yeah.
because, I think sometimes as customers, we forget that there's a person
Right.
on
Yeah.
the other side of that app, working hard to bring us our food.
100%.
It's easy to get caught up in the convenience of it all. What do they recommend?
So they really highlight the importance of, I think, like the human element.
Okay.
It's the little things that can make a really big difference. Being friendly,
Yeah.
confirming the customer's name to add that personal touch, going above and beyond to make sure that the food arrives on time and in perfect condition. Essentially, you want to exceed expectations wherever possible.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, a little effort can go a long way. Did they mention anything about, actually asking for tips?
So interestingly enough, they actually advise against that.
Mm.
They say don't do that.
Yeah, I can see why they would say that. Nobody wants to feel pressured.
Right.
And it could even be a turnoff for some customers.
Right. It comes back to that maintaining that sense of professionalism
Yeah.
and letting your excellent service speak for itself.
So, yeah, I mean, exceeding expectations, making that personal connection, it sounds like, even in this world of delivery apps, a little bit of that human touch can still go a long way.
It really can. And this actually ties into another interesting point that the source raises about being strategic about which orders you actually accept.
Okay.
It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that, more deliveries equals more money.
Right.
But they argue that that's not always the case,
Yeah.
especially with Uber Eats payment system.
Now that, what, you've actually piqued my curiosity here because I would have assumed that aside from maybe some obvious things like distance, that all Uber Eats orders were kind of created equal. How can some be more profitable than others?
So it all goes back to how Uber Eats factors in both time and mileage when they're calculating that driver pay. And the source actually even suggests like going as far as blacklisting certain restaurants.
Oh, really?
If you notice, they consistently have long wait times.
Ah, okay. So I see what you're saying. So it's about maximizing your efficiency, right? Every minute that you're spending waiting for an order at some, slow restaurant is a minute that you could be completing another delivery and earning more.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And while they don't dive deep into the specifics in this particular article, they do kind of hint at the existence of tools that can help drivers make those strategic decisions a little bit easier.
Okay.
Specifically, they mention an app called Para. Full disclosure, it is their own app. It's from the Para blog.
Sure. A little self-promotion there. I get it. But I'm always curious to hear about, tools that can give drivers an edge. So what's so special about Para? What does it actually do?
So from what they describe, it sounds like Para basically aggregates a lot of data to help drivers make more informed choices about which orders to accept, how to optimize their delivery routes. They even mention things like being able to see drop-off locations up front so you can plan your route efficiently.
Oh, interesting.
Even estimating your potential dollar per mile rate before you accept a delivery.
Wow, so it's like having a secret weapon, right? Like
Yeah.
get this little sneak peek into the profitability of each order before you even accept it.
Yeah.
So instead of just kind of taking the next one that pops up, you can kind of prioritize the ones that you know are going to make you the most money for your time.
And this actually ties in beautifully with what we were talking about earlier with the whole multi-apping thing.
Right.
Imagine juggling those multiple apps, but you also have this insight into which order from each app is going to be the most profitable.
Now you're talking next level strategy there. But on a more practical note, I'm curious, like, how does Para even work? Do they have some sort of like insider access to Uber's algorithm or something?
I don't think it's so much about having secret access as it is about leveraging the data that's already publicly available. They just found a really smart way to analyze and present it to drivers in a way that's actionable.
That makes sense. So it's less about like cheating the system, more about just understanding it, maybe a little bit better than the average driver.
100%. And speaking of understanding the system, they mentioned something else about Para that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
Apparently, they're developing a tip prediction feature specifically for Uber Eats.
Tip prediction. Okay, now that sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. Like, how could they possibly predict how much someone's going to tip?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, the source doesn't really get into the specifics of how it works.
Okay.
But it does highlight something that I think is super crucial for succeeding in the gig economy, which is that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more information that you have at your fingertips,
Right.
the better equipped you are to actually make smart decisions that impact, your bottom line.
So whether it's knowing which restaurants to avoid or mastering the art of multi-apping or even potentially, predicting those all-important tips, it seems like information is really key here.
Information is key, and while this source obviously is focused on Uber Eats, I think that this underlying message is relevant for anyone who's kind of working in the gig economy these days.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's about being proactive, seeking out that knowledge, finding those little edges that can help you get ahead.
And that's what this whole deep dive is really about, right?
Oh,
We're
well,
not just skimming the surface here.
yeah, yeah.
We're digging deep into the details, unpacking these strategies,
Yeah.
empowering you, the listener, to take control of your earnings.
I love that. We're like those explorers venturing out into uncharted territory, armed with our maps and compasses, ready to discover all the hidden treasures.
I love it.
Except in this case, the treasure is maximizing your Uber Eats payouts.
Now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
And speaking of uncovering those healing gems,
Yeah.
there's one final point from the source that I think is worth highlighting here. Even though Uber Eats might appear to have a lower base pay than some of the other platforms out there,
Mhm.
on the surface,
Right.
their high order volume and that unique payment structure can actually make it incredibly lucrative
Interesting.
for drivers who know how to work the system.
That's a really good point. So it's not always about just chasing like the highest paying gig at that exact moment,
Right.
but understanding the long game and how to maximize your earnings kind of like, over time.
Exactly. Sometimes those hidden gems end up being the most valuable.
So where do we even go from here? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've
Mhm.
talked about debunking the whole hourly rate myth. We've explored this whole concept of multi-apping. We even ventured into the world of temp prediction. What's the key takeaway here for our listeners? So someone's out there listening, maybe they've been driving for Uber Eats for a while, but they haven't really thought about some of these strategies. What's like one thing that they could take away from this and actually like try out on their next shift?
If it were me, I would say pick one tactic, whatever really resonated with you. Maybe it was, I'm finally going to try out this whole multi-apping thing. Or maybe it was, you know what? I'm going to be more selective about the restaurants that I'm willing to accept orders from.
Hmm.
And then just try it out on your next shift. It
Okay.
doesn't have to be this huge monumental change.
Right.
Even just like a small experiment, can be really revealing.
Yeah, it's like A/B testing your delivery driving.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
You've absorbed all this information, and now it's like, okay, let's actually put it into practice and see what moves the needle for you.
That's the beauty of this kind of knowledge, right?
Right.
It's meant to be shared, tested, refined, adapted. What works for one driver in, one city might not work for another.
Right.
It's all about finding your own winning formula.
And hey, maybe our listeners will discover some pro tips of their own and, share them with the deep dive community down the line.
I love it.
We can all learn from each other.
Absolutely. The more we share, the more we all benefit.
Well said. I think we've served up a pretty satisfying meal of Uber Eats knowledge today.
I think so.
We've really gone beyond those kind of basic surface level tips and dug into, the nitty-gritty of how to make those deliveries really work harder for you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure diving into this with you. I feel like I learn something new every time we do one of these deep dives, and I hope that our listeners feel empowered
Yeah.
to take control of their earnings, navigate this whole world of Uber Eats with confidence.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, everyone, happy delivering.